Welcome to Module 8 review for Marketing 690. First to review 7. In 7, you had 2 parts, corporate social responsibility. What do companies do to make sure that their company is one of those companies that is recognized to be one that is concerned about the environment, is concerned about poor working conditions for suppliers, is concerned about discrimination. Disaster relief is what do they do when there's a hurricane, a tornado, an earthquake, a fire, a flood. So what are the 2 things that companies do when faced with a crisis that is not of their own making? You needed to use citations and references, you needed to use examples, you needed details, you needed depth. You needed to draw conclusions that were informed and insightful, and you needed 2 peer replies. And for week 8, cultural sensitivity. You're going to be looking at things like the impact of color, direct and indirect communications. In some cultures, people speak directly, and others they do not. What's the implication of women in the workforce? What happens with different gestures that mean different things in different cultures? We need to be aware of cultural differences. You're going to look at some of the components of advertising and explain those differences. You're going to send an HR communication to employees in the United States and in another country. You are going to write different versions based on the cultural differences, and you're going to explain the cultural differences that you were cognizant of in writing those HR communications. Do not translate your communication into another language. You're going to write both of them in English, and you're going to look at real cultural differences, things that really impact the way we do business, and it should not just be that there are different holidays in different countries. Discussion 8 is incorporated into the final paper. Let me say that again. Discussion 8 is incorporated into the final paper. I cannot stress enough that the paper is not just combining milestones 1, 2, and 3. There are several additions. Leaving out the additions is going to cause you to get a low grade on the paper. Make sure you add the required elements. Do not leave them out. Papers worth 350 points, late papers 35-point deduction. It's due in Module 5, so you have another week without a paper due. I've said this before, but I'm going to repeat it. Eliminate redundancies. There are a lot of things from milestones 1, 2, and 3 that repeat. You're going to combine sections. You're going to implement corrections and improvement suggestions. Do not leave your mistakes in the paper. You're going to move messages, illustrations to appendices. Check to make sure your citations and references match. In APA, you cannot list a source as a reference if there is no citation. Confirm all required sections are included. You can do that by comparing your paper to the draft presentation, the sample paper as well as the rubric. Check your APA formatting and guidelines, no first person, no you, your, no contractions, and add the required sections. So the final paper, if you haven't already started it, I suggest that you do. This is not an easy paper to put together. That's why it's worth 350 points. I would start with the background of the products, the market, the brand for your selected company. I would then move into the poor working conditions scenario. You are combining the internal and external. So you're combining whatever you might say that was earlier in your communications context and communication need into the paragraph that comes right under poor working conditions. You're going to talk about the type and purpose for both internal and external. And is it inform, educate, or persuade? You're going to talk about the target audience for internal and external and the communication method for both. Be sure you include both. You are using your final communications. It's no longer draft, it's final. And you're going to put that in the appendix. Then you're going to add a section on brand, legal, and compliance implications that were discussed in discussion board 5. The next main session is discrimination in the workplace. Again, it's internal and external. And again, I might add the information that you had on communication context and communication need in a paragraph right under discrimination. Then you have your level 2 headings, type and purpose. This time, in addition to inform, educate, and persuade, you are talking about whether it's offensive or defensive. Offensive is proactive, defensive is reactive. Offensive strategy means you are implementing a new policy that is not based on an issue. Defensive means you had an issue that people know about, therefore it's a defensive strategy. Your target audiences and both methods of communication. Your final communication is in the appendix, and then you are adding brand, legal, and compliance implications for the discrimination scenario, and that is from DB6. The sections from this week's discussion board are also included. You're going to talk about international differences. You're going to have an HR issue communications between the US and another country. You're writing 2 different messages based on culture. You are not translating it into another language. You're considering the cultural differences that should be more than just a difference in holidays. And you are going to talk about why different messages are needed because of cultural differences. You're also going to be selecting different advertising. You're going to select an ad from 2 different countries, US and 1 other country, and you're going to analyze why advertising differences are important considerations. Module 9 will also add some additional sections. It's about the target market and brand values, and then you're going to have 1 summary for the entire paper. The conditions communication strategies that were in each of the milestone papers are not in the final paper. There is 1 summary for the entire paper. Here's how I suggest you do headings, and again, check the sample paper. I would start with an overview of your company, your selected company. My first main centered heading will be working conditions. It's covering internal and external. And again, this is where I would put the context and need. Your 3 subheadings are type and purpose. You're going to, in there, to be discussing the inform, persuade, educate. You're going to talk about your 2 different target audiences and justify them. And you're also going to include the method of communication, and then brand, legal, and compliance implications for the first scenario. My next main centered heading would be workplace discrimination, and it is the same as the poor working conditions. It's internal and external. Type and purpose, this time is going to add offensive, proactive, or defensive, reactive strategy. You should also talk about inform, persuade, and educate. Target audience and the method of communication, and the brand, legal, and compliance implications. My next main heading would be international differences. Internal is the HR messages. External are the 2 different ads. And my last content one is target market and brand values. You can divide that into 2 sections or leave it as 1. You have your summary for the entire paper. You have your references, which must match your citations, and you have your appendices, which you will see in the next slide. Appendix A is my internal working conditions message. Appendix B is my external working conditions message. C is internal discrimination. D is external discrimination. E, HR messages. I put US and foreign on 1 page. Appendix F is ads. I've put US and foreign on 1 page. Please note, you do not need communication context and communication needs sections as in the milestone papers. They can be incorporated into the opening paragraph for working conditions and discrimination sections. You do not need conditions communication strategy. You're writing 1 summary for the entire paper. Be sure your internal messages and the external ones as well, come from an individual. It doesn't come from the board. It doesn't come from the HR team. It comes from an individual. The messages for internal and external should not be exactly the same, but if you're going to say something important in one, it should be repeated. Review your return papers. Do not lose points for making the same mistakes and having the same issues. I know several times in papers I wrote repeat issue, repeat issue. Make sure you review those papers. Read your entire paper aloud before submitting. When you read aloud, you capture everything you actually said. When you read to yourself, you read what you think you wrote. Review the tips for papers. It was in announcements on 322. Critical thinking was announcements on 318. Sample paper was in announcements on 422. The press release format. If you are using an external press release, use the format that was posted on 322. Do not use a press release for internal. A press release does not come from the CEO because the CEO should not be the person taking messages from the media or answering their questions. You want to look at the rubric. I posted that in announcements on 422. Make sure you compare the paper you have written to the rubric before submitting. Again, people have failed this paper in every single class because they have not reviewed the paper and made changes, and they have not incorporated the additional sections. Please make sure you do it. I don't want to see anyone fail this paper. In summary, add your new sections, delete your redundant sections, incorporate feedback and correct errors, use the sample paper and rubric to help you. And if you haven't already started on this paper, you should. It is a major assignment. That's why there have been 2 weeks without papers due, so that you could start. It's 350 points. It can make or break your grade. So start now if you haven't already done so. And if you have any questions, please ask. Thank you for listening.